welcome back to the channel. Today, I just wanted to do a quick review of the book I just read, the first book of the Licanius Trilogy by James Islington, called The Shadow of What Was Lost. I really enjoyed this one. Now, I just wanted to preface this by saying this review and opinion is coming from someone who hasn't read The Wheel of Time yet. So a lot of people compare this to The Wheel of Time. A lot of people say that there's plenty of similarities. Some say that, it's unique in its own right and not to compare it with The Wheel of Time. But again, I have not read it yet. It'll probably be in my plans for next year. It's not a top priority for me at the moment. So I just wanted to get it out of the way that, take my opinion for what it's worth. I have not read The Wheel of Time. So those comparisons that maybe some of you are looking for, I won't be able to make. So anyway, I'm going to run through a bit of a review. I'll give you a little bit of a background, what the plot's about, what the story is about, what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, the kind of reader that this book might appeal to. I'll give you my final wrap up, my final thoughts with a rating, because I know people like ratings. And I'll do all of that without spoiling anything. This is a pretty complex book. It's a little bit difficult to review without giving anything away, but there's a lot to talk about in terms of what I enjoyed and what I didn't. So I'm gonna do my best, but not to worry, it'll be spoiler free, I promise. This one was published in 2014. Book number 1, Shadow of What Was Lost, part of the Licanius Trilogy, as I mentioned. If you go to the author's website, I believe the pronunciation is Licanius, but I call it Licanius because everyone else does, and to me, it actually sounds better. So this book basically takes place in a country called Andara, and Andara was a lot bigger back in the day, but now has been partitioned following an invasion that took place, a couple thousand years prior. And it has a boundary to the north that has a very significant role later in the story. So 20 years prior to where the story picks up, there was a rebellion called the Unseen War, where the people that were able to use magic were sort of in charge and had, the power in the world. People weren't having it. There was a rebellion. They got overthrown. And basically now there is a very, very different structure to the world in terms of how people who can use magic and those who can't interact and what roles they play now. We do have a hard magic system here, so it's pretty clearly defined. We know for the most part how it's used and the boundaries around it. I mean, there's still a ton to explore going into, the second and third book, but for the most part, it's a hard magic system. We understand the rules around it, and overall, it's pretty interesting. So anyway, one group that could use magic was overthrown completely because it was them that were mostly in power. They got overthrown completely. The other group of people that could use magic decided to accept a treaty and be bound by covenants, or what are called tenets in the story. And so their use of magic, everyone's use of magic really, is heavily controlled by a new organization called the administration. And so in the current state, people that can use magic are not very liked. People are not fans of magic people. Again, I won't spoil anything, but the one group which is bound by the tenants, this group gets trained at different schools or houses, because there are a few scattered around the world, but these are called tolls. These schools and houses are called tolls. So people that can still wield this magic are trained at these tolls. This is all very preliminary, very much background info. I promise it's not spoiling the plot, which gets very, very complex. So anyway, the story follows 4 points of view. We have Davian, Weir, Asha, and Caden. And it kicks off with Davian attending one of these tolls, one of these schools, and he's tasked with a quest. That leads him to leave the school, which is concurrent with another event that takes place that has significant impact on the rest of the story, but which Davian is unaware of. So the first book is really just about getting to know, the world, the characters, all the different factions, the different entities, who's exerting power over the world and who's fighting over it, and why. I have to say, I found all of the side characters really interesting as well, much more than I would typically find in a book. It almost feels like there are no side characters. Everyone's just contributing to the plot in different ways. But also, you're not overwhelmed with an abundance of characters, people that you can't remember who this person is or what that name was. But there's a little bit of that. I mean, there's a lot of information thrown at you in this first book, but it wasn't to a point where there were a lot of unnecessary characters that I really just didn't care about. I did care about all of them. So I kind of already started down this path, but I'll tell you what I liked about this book. So for me, the pacing was perfect. perfect. I was never bored. There weren't, lulls in the story, or at least if I was a little bit bored and I was eager to maybe get back to another part of the story that I was more intrigued by, I didn't have to wait too long. The pacing is great. It keeps moving along and you're not stuck in one point of the story for too long. And in my opinion, you're not following characters that you really don't care about. I think it really does a good job of bouncing back and forth between people's perspectives. So the pacing is great. It keeps things moving along and it ties all the plot lines together in a way that is pretty satisfying and keeps the story rolling. It didn't feel bloated. It didn't feel like there was a whole lot of fat left to trim, that wouldn't have been at the expense of the plot and the characters. It felt really lean, which is pretty impressive because this is like a 700 page book. This is a 690 page book. So that is pretty impressive. There's a lot of interesting history being uncovered and the stakes feel pretty high. While the world building isn't huge, it was definitely an environment that was interesting enough to be in. But there's tons of history to be explored. And I think that while there is a ton of information being presented in this first book, a lot of it is dispensed at the right times and in the right amounts. And there were a couple times where I was left wanting or needing a little bit more. It does a pretty good job of not info dumping or having long expositions. When I was left wanting more, I think that was deliberate on the part of the author. And I have to just trust that there's going to be more to the story and that he's going to fill in all the gaps down the road. Now, the story is pretty plot driven, which I prefer, but not at the expense of the characters. They all feel pretty fleshed out. They all have very unique voices. None of the characters are boring or unlikable or even deliberately unlikable. They're all just kind of characters that you're interested in, that you're rooting for in their own ways, and you can believe the chemistry that they have together and you can appreciate the friendship that's developing between some of these people. The story evolves and encourages a lot of theories, and by the end there are a few revelations that are pretty well done, but a lot more questions raised, and it makes it hard not to go ahead and pick up the second book right away. I am told by people that I trust that, you shouldn't space these out too long. There is a lot thrown at you. There are quite a few names and quite a few places. And really it's the history and the lore and the background that is serving to round out this whole story and bring this plot together. That can be a little bit complex. And so it's better if you read these as close as possible together as you can without getting overwhelmed. For me, that's probably going to be a book a month. Book one was pretty satisfying. I wouldn't say that it had a cliffhanger ending, but it makes you want to continue on with the next book as soon as possible to see if what you're thinking is even remotely true. Overall, I thought the writing was actually pretty digestible and pretty impressive. It was structured with enough care as to be impressive, but not be too pretentious, because that's a fine line to tread. It doesn't try to do too much. It was actually pretty easy to read, which is great because then you can focus on the plot and the story and the history and all the complexities that it's trying to draw in without being stuck on some unnecessarily clunky prose. I had a minor gripe with some cliche lines and some repetition. There were a couple things that were repeated throughout the book that made me cringe a little bit. There was the typical, he let out a breath that he didn't know he was holding. There was actually a funny point in the last quarter of the book where the line goes something like, he wiped away tears that he didn't know he was crying. And I just kind of laughed inwardly at that because that one was a little bit too much. But honestly, overall, I was super impressed. If this wasn't a debut endeavor, I probably would have toned down the rating to closer to a 4-star. I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. I rounded it up to 5 on Goodreads because I thought it deserved it. But again, if it wasn't a debut, it probably would have landed closer to a 4 for me, but it was a strong 4.5 for me because I really did enjoy it. To me, a 5-star book does not have to be a perfect book. Rarely are you going to see a perfect book. And again, that's always subjective. To me, books are art. And while you can point to, certain flaws in books, there are books that have typos and things like that maybe draw you out of the story. But objectively, the questions I ask myself are, did I enjoy it? Was I immersed? Did it do the things I wanted it to do? And did it avoid some of the things that I personally dislike in my books? And I thought for what it was trying to do, I thought it executed pretty well. So for me, I had a really good time. I thought the story was enriched. I thought the characters were really fun to follow. And at the end of the day, I cared enough to go ahead and pick up the next book whenever I have a chance to. And so for me, that was a successful book, and I don't mind throwing 5 stars around. So who do I think will like this book? Well, I think people who like plot-driven stories are going to really vibe with this one, but with multiple perspectives, with characters that, don't suck. If you like magic that's not too boring and that plays enough of a role in the story, but without being a crutch. If you like plot complexities and character development and maybe some politicking, there's not a whole lot there's a little bit of that. If you're okay with some time jumping, there's a little bit of that. There's alternate timelines and stuff being hinted at and explored again. There's not enough to go on in the first book, but there is a little bit of time jumping, I can tell you that. So if that's something that bothers you, you probably won't love this book. And if you welcome the typical fantasy tropes, there's definitely a little bit of found family, which is more of a theme than a trope, but there's definitely the orphan boy goes on a quest. There's a magical artifact. There's a bit of a chosen one trope, but again, we don't really know. That could be turned on its head. It's too early in the series for me to really theorize on that, but there is a little bit of what's hinted at as a chosen one, good and evil, that's hinted at as well. And this is a first book, so none of those tropes have had a chance to really fully play out. We'll see. I'm here for the second book. I can't wait to pick it up. I had a really, really good time with this first one, and I hope you go out and read it. I'd love to know what you think. I did a May TBR video not that long ago, and to be honest, I completely missed this one. I just wrapped up the first book, and I forgot to include the second one on my May TBR. So I may fit that one in. I may bump that one to June, but again, I hear that people say you should try and fit these in a tighter schedule with the entire story being presented in a much more cohesive way. So anyway, that's it for me, guys. Thanks for hanging out with me while I talk about The Shadow of What Was Lost. I'm curious for those who have read it, did you enjoy it? If you haven't read it, are you thinking about it? Because I've been hearing a lot of people talk about this lately, and I'm curious for more opinions, but we'll leave it there for now. As usual, guys, if you haven't subscribed, please consider it, and I will catch you on the next one.